It's time for our class to begin. If you'll have your Bibles, please turn to Ezekiel, the 29th chapter. We're in this section of the judgment upon the nations that Ezekiel is prophesying against. I think he's prophesying toward these cities, but he's doing it on behalf of Jerusalem. They need to know that God rules in the kingdom of men, and he'll rule these nations as well as he'll rule his own people. And they needed to hear the things of Ezekiel as he is in Babylonian captivity. And the events are going to be surrounding as we go through these last few chapters, and we're moving pretty fast today, that when we're looking at the relationship between Nebuchadnezzar, the king of what nation? The Chaldeans, Babylon, and you've got Egypt that we're going to be emphasizing, and we've got Jerusalem. Those three are involved, and there's 6 dated prophecies, 7 total, but 6 of them are dated that we see happening as you get closer and closer to 586 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar would destroy Jerusalem with fire and burn the town, break the walls down, and all those things that take place. So we see the relationship with Egypt, relationship with the Babylonians and God's people. So we begin in chapter 29, the idea of going against the things of Egypt. And what does he call Egypt? Question number 13. The ruler of Egypt is described in the first part of chapter 29 as a great what? He's a monster. He's a monster. I've heard a lot of things about politics lately, but I haven't heard anybody called a monster. They maybe call everything else, but not a monster. But he is a crocodile. Where is Egypt? Is the Nile River. And we're seeing that was a main river there. It connects the Red Sea, the Mediterranean Sea. And we see all the water, the Nile River. You'll have when you look at the idea of lower Egypt, it's really north. Upper Egypt is really south, because everything's slanting toward the Mediterranean Sea. But that Nile River floods. It had fertile ground. You had the Nile Delta near the Mediterranean Sea. But you had it all the way south to Ethiopia. And Egypt was indeed recognized as being this idea of that river being a prominent feature of their topography. And that's what we see taking place. He's out of the Nile. And we're going to see something else about that. He's described as a great monster. In verses 6 and 7, why is Egypt described as a staff of reed? It's a reed. It's a staff of reed, as if you're holding on to it. Why is it described that way? Because it's going to break. And when you're leaning on it, you're going to fall. And Egypt was just a staff that is a reed. It's not going to help Egypt at all. It's not going to help Judah at all. That's what he begins to say in verse 6. When he speaks about the fact that he's going to be the crocodile taken by the hooks, and all the fish that are hanging on the crocodile, those are all the nations that depend upon them. They're going to be thrown out into the wilderness, and they're going to be eaten by beasts. When you're out of the water, you're going to die, crocodile, and you're going to be involved in that. That's the judgment that's coming upon you, as we see take place there. And so when he says in verse 7, they took hold of thee by thy hand, and thou shalt break and disrend all their shoulders. If you're holding that, and all of a sudden your shoulder gets out of joint, because you're leaning on it. That's what he says is taking place. And when they leaned upon it, thou breakest, and madest all their loins to be at stand, meaning it's standing still, you're frightened, or the fact you're going to stand on your own, because Egypt's not going to help you. Your loins are going to have to do it all your own. Those are 2 ideas about those verses that are taking place. But he says, you're indeed just a reed that's a staff. It's not going to help my people Israel, as they needed to understand that. So what the nations were doing, those were powerful. God's people were depending upon them to protect them, when in reality, who is it supposed to be taking care of them? Somebody greater than all the nations. It's God. Question number 15, how did Egypt manifest unwarranted egotism? In this chapter 29, what is that? Had an ego. Yeah, he said it twice, didn't he? Verse 3 and verse 9. He speaks about that. He's going to put himself, who made that river? God created all those things. And yet he placed himself, and we see God's going to be dealing with these nations because they get out of control. We find that's not the only time God deals with kings. That happens to Nebuchadnezzar. That happens to all the great kings that said, I've done this. I built this. All of those things are taking place. So in verse 3, he said, Jehovah, saith the Lord, I'm against thee. And Jehovah beheld, I am against thee, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great monster that lieth in the midst of the rivers. And he said, this river is my own. I have made it myself. He continues that when he says, he's just a reed. He's not going to help you. And that's exactly what we see taking place in verse 9 of our chapter. So again, ego, right? Pride goes before a fall. That happens with individuals, happens with nations. What is the significance of Egypt's punishment in verses 12 and 13? What do you read there that's taking place in those verses that is kind of arresting and interesting, especially if you're a Jew? What is he going to do with Egypt? Send them in the wilderness, how long? And he will bring them back, will he not? Israel kind of used to that. Well, while you're gone, your city is desolate. Where your country that you want to be in is going to be desolate. I don't think this is a literal 40 years. It's the idea that indeed there's no history. There's no history that says there was indeed a 40-year break. Egypt was just nothing, and it came back to power. That's not in history. We've already seen that Ezekiel talks about you were with God in the Garden of Eden. He speaks about the Garden of Eden. He's going to speak it here in these last few chapters of our section. That you're like the tree of the Garden of Eden. Well, Garden of Eden's places were perfect. And the Garden of Eden trees envied you. And showing how great it was. Not that Egypt was in the Garden of Eden or that the kings were in the Garden of Eden. He's using that with that backdrop of what Israel, God's people, would know as he's prophesying about these nations about Egypt to Jerusalem, especially when they're depending upon them. They're just a reed, but he's also 40 years, idea of going out in the wilderness. God is going to bring destruction upon them, but he'll bring them back. But what do we see in those verses there, that what kind of kingdom will it be when it comes back? Let's look at verses 15. After verses 12 and 13, he'll bring them back. At the end of the 40 years, I will, verse 15, I'll bring together the Egyptians from the people that were scattered, and I will bring them the captivity of Egypt and cause them to come into their land of Pathros, which was a prominent place in Egypt, under the land of their birth, and they shall be there a base kingdom. They're no longer going to be powerful as they once were. And we're going to be seeing in this context, there was a time in the 4th year of Jehoiakim. This is before Zedekiah. This is before the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. That indeed there was the battle between Nebuchadnezzar and Pharaoh Hophra, who was indeed the Pharaoh of Egypt at this time. And Nebuchadnezzar is going to wound him enough that when he goes, he doesn't help the Jews against the Nebuchadnezzar. And he's going to wound him enough that when he goes back to Egypt, he's so not protected by his own people, they turn against him, and he will eventually die and open up the gates for Nebuchadnezzar when he does destroy Jerusalem to come in and take Egypt too. And that's what we're seeing in this connection here, that indeed that will take place. But you will indeed be a base kingdom. You're no longer going to be powerful as you once were. Now, in the midst of these dated prophecies, you find one that's dated verse 17. Tell me the year. 27th year. And we've been talking about in chapter 29 and verse 1, the 10th year and the 10th month. And this one here is the 27th year. And when we get to chapter 20 and chapter 30 and verse 20, it came in the 11th year. And all of the rest of these dates just follow the 10th year, and you got the 11th year, and we'll go to the 12th year in chapter 32. 12th year, Zedekiah ended his rule in the 11th year. What's happened? Jerusalem has been taken care of, and so has Egypt. And now you mourn Pharaoh. That's what we come to the end of this chapter. But all of a sudden, this one's put here. And tell me what happened. What is occurring here in these verses 17 through 20? Nebuchadnezzar is given Egypt for what reason? I didn't get to pay him back for what he did for me in Tyre, God thinks. That's what he's saying. I'm giving him now Egypt, payback time. When is it? We fast forward to 571 BC. Josephus says that that Nebuchadnezzar took 13 years to besiege Tyre, and he never succeeded. But I tell you, he did the same thing. He tried to do the same thing, tried to complete it, never finished it, of what Alexander the Great would do a couple centuries later. It's a remarkable fulfillment of prophecy. But what he's saying here is this is part what Ezekiel had prophesied, but it was found in this part of the section dealing with Egypt, because he's going to take Egypt. So he did him a great service against Tyre. That's why he's paid him back. He's paid him back with Egypt. God works in the kingdom of men. They're used. Then he's paid him back. And notice what he says here. Thy service, that great service at Tyre, that every head was made bald and every shoulder was worn. Why? Because they would carry those stones on their shoulders, their head bald. They would carry those stones trying to get an isthmus to come out there and connect with Tyre Island, which was the main fortress. Nebuchadnezzar took care of the mainland of Tyre. But that half a mile there, they worked and worked, tried to get that done, and it never happened. Who finished it? Alexander the Great. It became a bare rock. Only a place primarily for fishing nets. Great fulfilled prophecy that God did over time. Indeed, it was fulfilled. Now, that wasn't the end of Tyre. I mean, it goes up into the 12th, 13th century. We still see it over there now. But we see that indeed all the silt, all the things that filled up, it's a real large connection there with Tyre. And that ancient city has all of its things you could go see and look at antiquity and so forth. But Tyre, he did a great service bringing down Tyre. God uses nations against nations, but he puts it here in the context of Egypt, because indeed he's going to have Egypt. And that's exactly what takes place. Question number, before we go there, I want us to get an idea about the map that we're looking at. Because, first of all, before I go there, verse 21, what is this horn? In that I will cause a horn to bud forth, mean prosperous, unto the house of Israel, and I will give thee the opening of thy mouth in the midst of them, and they shall know that I am Jehovah. Over 11 times in this section, they'll know I'm Jehovah, and most of the time it's connected with judgment. And I think the same thing here. Some have said that's the prophecy about Jesus. Yes, he was a branch, a shoot, Isaiah 11:1. He was one that would come forth and be both priest and king, Zechariah 6. That kind of nails it down who Jesus is. He's both priest and king. And that would only connect with Christ. And he was one that, there indeed prophecies about that. But right here in the midst of judgment against Egypt, who would be, what is the concept of a horn? It just sounds loud, or is it show power in an animal? It's horns. Is that power? It's a concept of the word. It's powerful. Who's powerful? I think Nebuchadnezzar is going to bud. He's the one that's budding. And when that happens, Ezekiel, you're going to talk again, because it's happening just as God said so. You'll be able to speak in the midst of them, and that they shall know that I am Jehovah. Again, my prophecies are going to be fulfilled. I'm going to be exalted, and I'm the one in control. So we come to chapter 30. We don't have a date on this, but we do have the idea of judgment coming against them. And so I want us to see the judgment. He mentions some cities. He mentions some things that are going to take place. Notice one of them. When we go back to chapter 29, he speaks about the tower that that's mentioned, and mentions it as it may be Migdal to Sereni. Some of the newer translations have that. But he says in verse 6, thus said Jehovah, they also shall uphold Egypt, those that uphold Egypt shall fall, and the pride of her power shall come down from the tower of Sereni. So we say, well, where's that? When you go to the upper part of Egypt, that's south, and you notice Elephantine, or Elephantine, but it's Elephantine. Cush should be Ethiopia. He said from that place there, of course, that is an island on the Nile River. And this word Sereni has a tower there where it could protect that area. And it is mentioned there, and that's the south part. And of course, your footnote says, and from Migdal to Sereni. Migdal would be, if it's going about from south to north, north to south, showing this great expanse where the judgment's going to come. A lot of times God's prophecy does that. When you do that, that would be up in this area right up there with the Red Sea goes up there toward the Mediterranean Sea, and you got a little Lake of Galilee, looks like. It's right between the Red Sea, and that is where Megiddo is. And there's that great expanse, a tower where you could have protection from south to north. It's going to be judgment is going to come upon you. And you have a lot of these cities like No is the idea. That's Thebes that we look at here under Gebtu that we have there. Up there you have Memphis. That's not Tennessee. That's Memphis, Egypt. And you have Memphis there, and right above in that area you have Cairo, which is a capital we know today of Egypt. But the River Nile flows south to north, and it's going downhill. That's how it's going to get down there. And there's this great delta there, agriculture there. You'll see Tephanes. You got that mentioned in this section. These cities that were prominent in the days of Egyptians' power are going to be brought to their knees. And it's going to be Nebuchadnezzar that's involved in doing that. And that becomes very, very important. So what happens after God breaks Egypt's arm? So we have that judgment coming upon them. And all of a sudden, in verse 20 of chapter 30, it shall come to pass in the 11th year, in the first month, in the 7th day of the month, that the word of Jehovah came to me, saying, Son of man, I have broken the arm of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Now, here, days of Jehoiakim, he broke his arm. He wounded him, where he was not going to be the power that Jerusalem thinks he ought to be. From now on, he's wounded. He goes back home, and he has problems at home. Finally, he dies. But what's significant? When did the surge, or when did the besiegement of Jerusalem begin by Nebuchadnezzar? What year? The 9th year. And in the 11th year, and the 5th month is when he burned it down. Are we real close to that? Arm of Egypt has been wounded, and now he's in 2 months he'll be taking Jerusalem, and he'll go in, and weakened Egypt will be easy to take, and he'll capture them and so forth. So we're looking at a time frame here where we get back to this norm. Well, in the 10th year came to pass in the 11th year, we're getting close to that indeed he wounded his arm so much that he emphasizes the rest of that chapter. He emphasizes it 3 times, just kind of like say, nay, nay, amen, amen, or verily, verily. He emphasizes that. He states it, emphasizes it again, that his arm is so broken, he can't hold a sword. He drops his sword, and who has the sword in his hand? Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. I will strengthen the arms, in verse 24, of the king of Babylon, and put my sword, God says, in his hand. And I will break the arms of Pharaoh, and he shall groan before him at the groanings of a deadly wounded man. I will hold up the arms of the king of Babylon, and the arms of Pharaoh shall fall down, and they shall know that I am Jehovah, when I shall put my sword in the hand of the king of Babylon. He just said that. Why does he say that? Emphasis. These are poetic things, may have been put to music, may sing it, realizing this judgment is going to come upon them. He shall stretch it out upon the land of Egypt. And he says, and I will scatter the Egyptians among the nations and disperse them through the countries, and they shall know that I am Jehovah. Judgment. You know me by my judgments. And so he's emphasizing the broken hand, the broken arm. It can't hold the sword. Egypt is going down. That's the point that he's making. And they dates that. And he's just a couple of months from it being fulfilled. In chapter 31, what lesson does the prophet offer concerning greatness among the nations? So what's 31 about? And it's a beautiful picture of a tree. What kind of trees were well known in Lebanon? The cedars. And he's now going to say, let's think about Assyria, for example. And Assyria had been taken by Babylon. It wasn't the strong power as it was, but he speaks about that. So at verse 1, came to pass in the 11th year, I'm in the 3rd month now, in the 1st day of the month, 2 months away, and the word of Jehovah came unto me, saying, Son of man, say unto Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and to his multitude, whom art thou like in greatness? And we already know Egypt thinks he's great. Pharaoh does. Well, who art thou like in greatness? Behold the Assyrian. The Assyrian was a cedar in Lebanon. Pharaoh, you're going to be a cedar in Egypt. You're pretty special. But he uses Assyria. Why is that? Syria has gone down. Syria is not the world power. God has been involved in taking Assyria down. Behold, the Assyrian was a cedar in Lebanon. And notice he had fair branches with a forest-like shade and of high stature. And the top was among the thick boughs and boughs, and waters nourished it deep. It did grow. You just get a picture of this flourishing tree in Lebanon. Notice in verse 6, all the birds of the heavens made their nest in its boughs, and under its branches did all the beasts of the field bring forth their young, and under its shadow dwelt all the great what? Literally so. We said, well, you got a big tree. But notice this idea, this concept of a tree that's so tall and big and well watered, and the branches are out there for the birds to nest in, for underneath that, the beasts of the field to bring forth their young. All the nations are protected from the sun. Beautiful picture. Syria, you must be great. The cedars of the garden of God, verse 8, could not hide it. The fir trees were like its boughs, and the plains tree. Some say that's a chestnut tree. It had a bare. It's plain. It had a bare trunk, and it looked like the chestnut tree, whereas its branches. Nor was there any time in the Garden of Eden like unto it in its beauty. Now, when God created everything and brought things to the garden, things were very good. Can't compare it. Look who's envying this cedar of Lebanon. Verse 5, I made it fair by the multitude of its branches. That I protected so much, benefited so much, so that all the trees of Eden that were in the garden of God envied it. That's a perfect place. In Syria, you're like where everybody would be once, and they would envy you. You're that great. What happened to Syria? God brought it down. Therefore, in verse 10, said the Lord Jehovah, because thou art exalted in stature, and hast set his top among the thick boughs, and his heart is lifted up to its height, it says, I even deliver him into the hand of the mighty one of the nations, and shall surely deal with him. Now I have driven him out for his wickedness. And strangers and the peaceable of the nations terrible of the nations, these are great powerful nations, have often left him. And upon the mountains and all the valleys, his branches are fallen, boughs are broken. All the water courses of the land, all the peoples of the earth are gone down from his shadow, and they've left him. Birds are hopping on the broken branches. Beasts are walking over all the branches that are broken. The trees is down. That's the picture that he's given. And so they're no longer a help to people. You're thinking Jerusalem, you're thinking Egypt's going to help you? They may exalt themselves, but here's what's going to take place. Thus saith the Lord, in the day when he went down to Sheol. What's Sheol? Went down to the grave. I caused a mourning. I covered the deep for him. I restrained the rivers thereof, and the great waters were stayed. And I caused Lebanon to mourn for him, and all the trees of the field fainted for him. I made the nation to shake at the sound of his fall, when I cast him down to Sheol, and them that descend into the pit, and all the trees of Eden, the choice and the best of Lebanon, all that drink water, were comforted in the nether parts of the earth. They consoled one another. They're all dead. And these great trees, all those things, that's in Syria was envied by the greatest of the trees in Eden. There's the picture that he paints. And they also went down to Sheol with him, and they were slain by the sword, yea, and they were his arm that dwelt under the shadow of his midst of the nations. To whom art thou thus like in glory and in greatness among the trees of Eden, Egypt? How are you compared to that? Yet shall he be brought down the trees of Eden under the nether parts of the earth, and it shall lie in the midst of the uncircumcised with them that are slain by the sword. This is Pharaoh and all his multitudes, saith the Lord Jehovah. Punchline. He tells us a big story, didn't he? You get the picture. Trees of Eden envied him, Syria. But they no longer were the power that they once were. I, Jehovah, I'll bring him down. Bring him down. And that's you, Pharaoh. That's going to be you. So what lesson does the prophet offer concerning greatness among the nations? That Jerusalem needs to hear. David? That's right. There's not a one that can avoid that. As we get Daniel, he rules in the rule of men. Kingdom, singular. Not kingdoms, he's talking about different kingdoms. The kingdom, the whole concept of man ruling. And these rulers, they're considered gods. And Augustus, he wanted to be the principal citizen. He didn't want to be a dictator. Julius Caesar kind of wanted to be a dictator in February. In March, he's dead. They took care of him. And all the conflicts in nations take place, and sometimes kings fall by civil wars that occur. But what we see here is that God is behind all of this, and here is a prophecy just before Nebuchadnezzar would come and burn down Jerusalem, a couple of months, which in that trip he's going to be taking a weakened, broken arm, Egypt. And God has sent you, Pharaoh, in your multitude. This is what you are, and this is what's going to happen to you. So we exalt ourselves above God, and consider, well, he said, I created the Nile. That's what Pharaoh was doing, and that became something that was difficult. Okay? So we see these prophecies rolling in here. We're looking at about a couple of years, 587 to 1 year after the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar that is taking place. All right? Question number 21. In chapter 32, so here's this whole chapter here. Why is Pharaoh comforted by what he sees in Sheol? Again, we're going to get to the end of the story, and all the things that are taking place, we'll begin to see those things occurring. So it came to pass in the 12th year, in the 12th month, 2 weeks later, it comes in the 15th day of the month in verses 17 following. So here is after Jerusalem is conquered by Nebuchadnezzar, there's lamentations over Pharaoh. During this particular time, we know that indeed Egypt was conquered by them. Egypt would come back, but their land will be left desolate as far as they're concerned. But they will come back. So we see things unfold here that are taking place. We see interesting things like verse 7. And when I shall extinguish thee, I will cover the heavens and make the stars thereof dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give its light. All the bright lights of heaven will I make dark over thee, and set darkness upon thy land, saith the Lord Jehovah. That's imagery that we see taking place when nations fall. That's what's going to happen to Jerusalem in the days of Jesus. He spoke in terms like that. That's the way the prophets spoke. Let's talk about the Garden of Eden. King, you've been there. You're like Assyria was like a tree in the Garden of Eden. Exalted. All the other trees were envious of it. It's imagery, maybe not literal fulfillment that those things took place, but darkness is coming over your land. And he sets forth this idea of grabbing them. You know, you once were a lion, in verse 2. You consider a young lion in the nation. Thou art as a monster in the seas. He's repeating. This again is a new prophecy. And he begins to speak about some of the same things. Our politicians do that when they use the same terminology. They may say the same thing again. It's a different speech. And that's what he's doing here. So you're breaking forth the rivers, they trouble the waters, and thy feet, and thou foulest the rivers. And thus saith the Lord, I will spread out my net upon thee. Notice it's my net upon thee, with the company of many peoples, and they shall bring thee up in my net, and I will leave thee upon the land, so you can rot and deteriorate, and all the beasts can eat you. Just like he said earlier. Broken down branches in Assyria. You're going to be powerful. You're not going to be powerful any longer. And I will lay thy flesh upon the mountains and fill the valleys with the heights. Some say that's the idea of the worm that eats the dead bodies, fills up the valleys. You salted from a mountain, you're brought down, and then the height is a rottenness, corruption that takes place with the worms eating the bodies and filling, that expanse. The height, Hebrew terms can denote that. Also the water with thy blood, and the land wherein thou swimmest, even in the mountains, and the watercourses shall be full of thee. And I shall extinguish thee, and I will cover the heavens, the darkness, and so forth. So you see that taking place. Again, verse 12, by the swords of the mighty will I cause thy multitude to fall, the terrible of the nations, and they shall bring naught the pride of Egypt, and all the multitude there shall be destroyed. Again, pride brings nations down. Again, we see that set forth. I'll destroy all the beasts thereof from beside many waters, neither shall the foot of man trouble them any more, nor the hoofs of beasts trouble them. Then I will make their waters clear, and their rivers run like oil. And it'll run smoothly when he clears out the debris. It'll run like oil, said the Lord Jehovah. And when I shall make the land of Egypt desolate and waste, a land destitute of that whereof it was full, and I will smite all of them that dwell therein, they shall know that I am Jehovah. Again, that's why earlier the idea of the horns going to come and know I'm a Jehovah, it's kind of still in the context of judgment. That's why I think it's Nebuchadnezzar and not Jesus, though he could come in judgment. And sometimes the idea to know that I'm Jehovah is looking at his grace. Right here, we're looking at a context that's pretty well set on judgment. So, verse 17, it came to pass in the 12th year, in the 15th day of the month, a couple of weeks later, the word of Jehovah came to me, saying, Son of man, he said, wail for the multitude of Egypt, and cast them down, even her and the daughters of the famous nations under the nether parts of the earth, with whom shall go down into the pit. So, here's the imagery of going down into the pit of Sheol. And he mentions nations that we see. And they've all been conquered. They've all gone to Sheol. All their swords are laid down. Their bodies will cover them in the pit, in Sheol, in the grave. So verse 22, my Bible says Asher is there and all her company. What does your Bible say, David? Assyria. That's the same thing. Assyria. Assyria. And we see there's her graves are round about. All of them slain, fallen by the sword. So here's this great nation, all the multitudes connected with that nation, whose graves are set in the uttermost part of the pit, and her company is round about her grave, and all of them slain, fallen by the sword, who cause terror in the land of the living. So we know where Assyria is, and we can go northwest of Babylon, find that place. Now, where do you find Elam on a map? Let's go southeast of Babylon, and you'll find the nation of Elam. So he's taken that area up there. We're going to Syria, Chaldeans. They're in their moment. Babylon, they'll be taken care of too. But now we go southeast of there. We go to Elam, all her multitude about her grave, slain, fallen by the sword. They're going down to uncircumcised. They're not my people. They're nations. He's brought them down. And he says it caused their terror in the land of the living. While they lived, they were powerful. They were a terror. You don't want to hear their chariots, the hoofs of their horses. It's a frightful thing. And Jerusalem Jews thought they could have protection, and they couldn't hide from God. These have set her bed in the midst of the slain with all their multitude, her graves round about. You get the point. They're in their graves. So let's look at those. Musha and Tubal. Meshesh and Tubal. Those are the ancient nation families in Asia Minor. So we kind of Chaldea, we first we got Assyria, come down to Elam, we go back over there up to Asia Minor, and you have these nations. Same thing happens to them. Verse 29, there is Edom. Now we go south of the Dead Sea, we go southeast, we go south now. And we round this nation of Edom, her kings and all her princes, who in their might are laid there with them, the slain by their sword. In verse 31, and Pharaoh shall see them. So you got Eden, you've got Meshach and Tubal, you have Elam, you have Assyria. All of them, all around Jerusalem, all around Egypt, they've had their place. They could terrorize people, they had power. But where are they all now? Numbered among the uncircumcised, and they're in Sheol. They have died to get there. Now, we're asking here, why is he comforted? I'm going to read verses 31 and 32. Pharaoh shall see them and shall be comforted over all his multitude. They're dead too. Even Pharaoh and all his army slain by the sword, saith the Lord Jehovah. For I put his terror in the land of the living. He's had his moment of terror. And he shall be laid in the midst of the uncircumcised, with them that are slain by the sword, even Pharaoh, in this case it's Hophra, and all the multitude saith, and all his multitude saith the Lord Jehovah. That's how he brings it to an end. How could you be comforted? Didn't say confounded. It means to breathe. It's to breathe out. And what's he seeing? All the nations. Yep, I interrupted. Who answered that? So why do you think he's comforted? He went alone in his misery. That's right. And what's God trying to get everybody to see? I'm in control. I'm in control. And Jerusalem, you think you're getting ready in a couple of months. Now we're past that point. We're into the area where that besiegement has ended and taken there, and you got all the turmoil taking place in that region, even into Egypt. You realize that God is in power. And all God wanted the people of God to do is to serve Him, only Him, not the gods of these people. But our power doesn't lie in chariots and horses. Our power lies in Jehovah, the Lord. And that's what we see. I think He's comforted. Well, we're all here together. You're dead. That's the way of the living. That's the way of all life. We live. We can be a terrifying nation. We can be an exalted king or Pharaoh. And that's the end of it. And there's a sense, God used that term of comfort there, in a sense of how can we comfort one another? Well, nobody got higher than I did. We're all here together. I don't know what hell will be like, but there may be something like that. Well, I guess weeping and gnashing of teeth are mad at God, but they're all in the same boat. And that's the only reason I can say that He doesn't feel so bad. Because that's the way of all nations that turn against God. All right, any thoughts or comments you want to add to that? Okay, we'll start there in chapter 33, lesson number 7. Lord willing, next time, thank you for your comments and following along. Appreciate it.